Well, good afternoon, and welcome to World Affairs 2014, the annual conference of the World Affairs Council. My name is Peter Robertson, and I'm chairman of the Board of Trustees, and I'm delighted to be able to join you here this afternoon. I look forward to the World Affairs Conference every year. It's an opportunity, I think, to gain a more nuanced perspective of the world and our role in it, guided by global thought leaders and inspired by the exchange of ideas with each other. We'll have the chance to weigh and develop informed opinions on the issues and actions shaping our world. As in prior years, we're going to touch on many of these issues. For example, innovation in the world economy and in Africa in particular, U.S.-Russia relations, immigration reform, the post-Arab Spring, the changing role of the media, cybersecurity, privacy versus national security, Iran, North Korea, and nuclear weapons, and much more. I guess we're going to be here for a month. So yesterday I got back home from a business trip that included Edinburgh in Scotland, Johannesburg in South Africa, and Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And in Edinburgh, there's a feverish debate on the upcoming vote on Scottish independence from the UK, 400 years after the union of the crowns and 300 years after the union of the parliaments. Scotland, Catalonia, and other independence seekers are becoming a major issue for the European Union, even if it's not on top of their list today. In Johannesburg, the struggle to transition to a new South Africa, where all its citizens are represented in the economy, where everyone has opportunity, and to do all of this peacefully, is far from over. And in Riyadh, an incredible transformation of what is still a relatively new country is taking place. It feels like an island of stability and a storm of unrest sweeping the area. Progress is dramatic and undeniable, but political differences with our strongest ally, the United States, over Syria, Iran, Egypt, and others, are on everybody's mind. And this was just one person's 2-week business trip, but it's a microcosm of the world we live in. And all of these and dozens of other similar and worse situations have implications far beyond their borders and will impact the lives of millions, if not billions of people. And I believe it's our responsibility as citizens of the world to try to understand these situations, to develop our opinions, and to do what we can to help others do the same. So if you agree with me, you've come to the right place. And by the way, I'm scheduled to go to Moscow and Kiev in June, so I'm going to be listening pretty carefully to what goes on here. World Affairs 2014 would not be possible without the generous support of our partners and sponsors. And so we'd like to thank our conference lead sponsor, Chevron, Wells Fargo Bank's International Group for its important support of the Council and our education program, our Next Gen Changemakers reception sponsor, Google, our veteran fellowships sponsor, the Marines Memorial Association, Union Bank for its support of our youth outreach initiative, our community partner, Books, Inc. If you come from Scotland, you say Books, Inc. And our promotional partners, Foreign Policy Magazine and Euronique Communications. Lastly, I want to say how proud I am to be associated with Jane Wales, Carla Thorson, and their team, the staff of the World Affairs Council, who have worked tirelessly to bring all this together. They deserve an enormous thank you from all of you and from all of us for their dedication to making this really a spectacular event. So welcome to all of you. I hope you have a fascinating next, 36 hours or something like that. I know I will. And so with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to our CEO, Jane Wales. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, and welcome to World Affairs 2014. If you are wondering, if you have a kind of a point of view you want to share or a question that desperately needs answering, you've come to the right place. We're going to be spending the next 2 days taking a look at some of the issues that are on the headlines and on the evening news, but go into much greater depth in conversations that will take place on stage, in conversations that will take place in the hallways as well, because we hope that you've come here to teach as well as to learn, because we have so much to learn from you. No matter what, the conversations will be engaging and in depth, and so thank you so much for being part of them. If events, I mean, Peter talked a little bit about the kinds of topics we're looking at. I kept looking through and sort of say, well, what's on my mind right now that I want to most go to? I just got asked which breakout I was going to, and I kept thinking, well, if you're riveted by the global economy right now, and with the drop in stock prices yesterday, many are, you really want to talk to Tom Friedman, who's taken a look at what the impact is of the information revolution on the one hand and economic integration on the other. What's that impact? Why is it having the effect of privileging agility, rewarding agility on the part of countries, on the part of companies, on the part of individuals? I want to talk to him. But if you're also, like me, thinking about the relationship between Russia and the West in the face of a confrontation or a crisis, a mounting crisis in Ukraine, and with Sunday's referendum on Crimea's effort to secede, you really want to talk to Stephen Sestanovich. He is one of these few policy practitioners who's got really a deep understanding of post-Soviet politics. So I'm eager to talk to him. There's also, I mean, he can help us understand what are their interests, Russia's interests, what are our interests, and where do they actually collide. I think the issue of Syria is probably the one that's most on my mind. It looks like a problem absolutely without solution. At the same time, when you think about Egypt, you really wonder, is there a way to get past autocracy? Will autocracy just come in many clothes and many suits, or will it be fundamentally different? And there I'd argue that I can think of no better person to talk to than Marwan Mouasher, who is the former foreign minister and former deputy prime minister in Jordan. And what he will argue is that until you've got an embrace of pluralism in that part of the world, you're never going to have the basis for democracy to be built. And what's interesting about hearing from him, from Minister Mouasher, was that he's about to return to Jordan. He's returning to the region that he holds so dear to try to build a movement for pluralism. So he's walking the talk. He's going to be joined by a Brookings scholar, that's Sadi Hamid, who's got a specialty in Islamic politics as well, political parties, and their relationship to democratic reform. And then finally, of course, Edward Snowden keeps coming back in the news. And so I would argue that checking out the breakout on what Peter calls privacy, and the rest of us call privacy and security, and see what they have to say. So before one thing I would just note is that what you'll find is what we always find at the Council, and that is that many of the issues that we consider to be global and international have strong domestic consequences or implications, and many of the decisions we take domestically have international ramifications that we usually consider, but not always. And I can think of no issue that brings that home more than immigration, which will be what our keynote speaker will address and our first panel will consider. So before turning us over to that panel, let me just ask, I just have 4 things to ask of you. And the first is to get to know the students. There are 50 students from high schools, community colleges, universities here along with their teachers. They are part of a scholarship program we have, which you made possible. And so please get to know them. They have so much to bring to this conference. The second, thank you for your support for them. The second thing I ask of you is that you get to know some of the veterans that are here. We're lucky enough to have a Veterans Fellow program in partnership with the Marines Memorial, I'll get there somehow, Association. And General Mike Myatt there is the person who actually thought of the idea and has helped make that possible. So a shout out to Mike, and please get to know these veterans. And then third, while you are thanking Mike, please also thank the sponsors that Peter has named. Get to know and thank our trustees. Get to know the staff who are here to serve you. These are the folks that make things happen, not just today and tomorrow, but every day of the year. And we're deeply grateful to all of them. So finally, let me just talk about your role for a quick moment. What we hope you'll do is engage. Engage in whatever way works best for you. And right now I'm talking not only to those of you in this almost full room, but those who are watching the streaming video of this conference as well, who couldn't be physically here with us, but are with us virtually. You can interact with one another. You can interact with the speaker. You can make your point. You can ask your question either in person or by Twitter. And so all I do is ask that you use hashtag WA2014 in doing so, so that we've got the engagement not only of the people in the room, but the people over the airwaves. So let me introduce our opening panel. Corey Johnson, who's anchor and editor-at-large at Bloomberg Television, is going to moderate our opening panel. So please join me in welcoming Corey to the stage.
All right. This thing might be on. It might be on. Thank you all for being here. We want to get this started because there's lots of good stuff to discuss, and I want to get to it. But the notion here is to put a human face on integration. We've got a great panel to do that. Jose Antonio Vargas is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and founder of DefineAmerica.com. Simon Rosenberg is president and founder of the New Democratic Network, NDN. And Tara Magner, the program officer at the MacArthur Foundation. But just as a preface, the whole notion of comprehensive immigration reform seemed like it was one of those things that was just never going to be addressed in Washington, and you might argue that it suddenly seems like that again. But it does seem to be a top policy item for both parties right now, with a growing consensus that some kind of solution has to be found. And from my perspective as an anchor of a technology-focused program on the Bloomberg Television Network, the notion of targeted immigration reform, high-tech workers, right? Everybody likes their high-tech workers. We want more Mark Zuckerbergs to pay PR Amadors, whatever, to pay tax, right? But the notion of a comprehensive change in the law to provide workers for all parts of the economy seems to be an important issue that I think more and more businesses are starting to recognize. But how is that going to happen, and what are the impediments to getting there? We're going to discuss some of those challenges. And since this is about the human face of integration, we're going to first hear the personal story of Jose Antonio Vargas, who, among other things, is himself an undocumented immigrant. So let me welcome Jose up, who's going to address us first. Jose?
Thank you. Good afternoon. How are you? It's really a pleasure to be here and share the stage with Corey and Tara and Simon Rosenberg, who's one of my mentors and one of the smartest people I know. So I'm really happy to be here. So I have to tell you, I have done ever since, quote unquote, coming out about my undocumented status in the New York Times almost 3 years ago, I've done about 190 events in 40 states in 2.5 years. Some Tea Party meetings, actually, a lot of lectures in college campuses in the South and in the Midwest. And the whole idea is to kind of show the human face of immigration, right? And I come to you as one of our country's 11 million undocumented immigrants, many of us Americans at heart, but without the right papers to show for it. And I think too often we're treated as abstractions, faceless and nameless, right? Subjects of debate and political football, rather than individuals with families and with hopes and with dreams and with fears. And I am, let's also be perfectly honest, the most privileged undocumented immigrant in America. While people are getting deported every day, while students and workers fear for their lives, here I am flying across the country talking about my life, reminding people that immigration is way more complicated than the illegal in our minds and the US-Mexico border. So let me back up. So my name is Jose Antonio Vargas. It doesn't get any more Latino than that. I look Asian. Just in case you wanted to know, when you see an Asian guy with a Hispanic name, it usually means they're Filipino. There are 4 million of us here in America. I'm gay. I'm undocumented. In college, not too far from here, I went to San Francisco State University. I majored in political science and African American studies. So basically, I should just marry a Jew or a Native American and call it a day. And traveling around the country as kind of this walking, uncomfortable conversation, the point has been to tell people that I am not the illegal that you think I am, and this issue is not what you think it is. And what's been astounding as you have these uncomfortable conversations with people is like, why do they speak Spanish at Walmart? Can't they speak English? Why don't they want to learn and embrace America? Don't they like being here? I mean, these are questions that I would get asked in Alabama and Wisconsin and in Iowa. So actually, in response to that, very recently, DefineAmerican.com, which is this media and culture campaign that I founded, we recently launched a video that promotes a new symbol for the immigrant rights movement. And when my team and I were thinking about what kind of video should we do, I said, well, why not have 30 undocumented people look straight to the camera and pledge allegiance to this flag that doesn't belong to us, right? So here's that video of the pledge.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States of America
and to the republic
for which it stands,
one nation,
under God,
indivisible,
with liberty and justice
for all.
for all.
I was born in Mexico City,
Kolkata, India,
Honduras,
Nairobi, Kenya,
Philippines,
Lima, Peru,
Rosario, Argentina.
I work as a housekeeper,
college student,
math teacher,
congressional intern,
aspiring biochemist.
I've been in the United States for over 25 years.
24 years.
13 years.
This is the place where I became who I am. This is the place I grew up in. I understand the meaning of giving, of making a change.
Pledging allegiance to a flag that has not yet recognized me means living in fear.
shows me how much work there is left to do.
When I see the American flag, the first word that comes to mind
is pride.
Dreams.
Health.
Heart.
Patriotism.
Unity.
Liberty and freedom and many opportunities. Yeah.
Pledging allegiance means I am a part of America.
It's a small yet meaningful way to show that I am an American.
I may not have been born in America, but America was born in me.
How do you define American?
How do you define American?
How do you define American?
Take the pledge.
Join us at defineamerican.com.
And when I finished this video, I emailed it to Mark Meckler, who's the co-founder of the Tea Party Patriots.
I pledge allegiance.
Who has become a friend of mine. And I said, here's a video. What do you think, Mark? And he said, this actually made me cry. And that's when I knew that I did my job, right? And I actually think it's interesting for me because there's this notion and there's this perception that people like us don't want to be American because maybe we have accents or maybe because we have other flags or all those things. So I wanted to take something that was so quintessentially American, the Pledge of Allegiance, right, and kind of turn it upside down, right, and say what it does and how it speaks to people like me. So again, let me back up. When I was 12, my mother decided that she wanted to give me a better life, and for whatever reason, she decided that a better life wasn't in the Philippines. So she put me on a plane, and 18 hours later, I was in Mountain View, California, not too far from here. August 1993. My introduction to American culture was the O.J. Simpson trial, Nancy Kerrigan's knee getting whacked, and Seinfeld. And you know, my grandparents, who my mother sent me to, they got here legally. They actually immigrated to this country legally in the mid-1980s. And when my grandfather became an American citizen, he changed his name from Teofilo to Ted, after Ted Danson in Cheers. It's because grandparents cannot legally petition their grandkids to come here. It's not considered a close enough of a relationship. Check that out for immigration codes. He decided that he was going to pay a smuggler $3,500 to get me here. I didn't know this. I just got here. All I know is like one of my earliest memories in 6th grade in Mountain View was when we had to pledge allegiance and also sing the national anthem. And I actually thought they said, "Oh, Jose, can you see?" So I was like, oh my God, I just got here and my name is already in the national anthem. They're so friendly. And of course, like I realized that my classmate, Sharman, was actually like, dude, Jose, like we're not talking about you. 4 years after that, when I went to the DMV to apply for a driver's license and didn't tell my grandparents, I just went to the DMV, that's when I found out that my green card that my grandfather had given me was fake. After the woman at the DMV said, this is fake, don't come back here again. So that's how I found out. And in some ways, what happened between 16 years old and 18 years old were like probably the most, it formed the foundation for the rest of my life. The year after this, my English teacher, Mrs. Dewar, said I asked too many annoying questions and I should do this thing called journalism. I didn't know what that was. We didn't read newspapers at home. We had no books. But when you become a news journalist, you have a thing called a byline, which meant that your name was on the paper. So I figured if I can't be here because I don't have the right papers, what if I'm on the paper? I mean, I know it sounds really naive, but I actually thought that this was a way to exist, was to be on this piece of paper. So I wrote for the Mountain View Voice. For 4 years, I worked at the San Francisco Chronicle, not too far from here, as a reporter. And I just wrote as much as I could. How can they say I don't exist if I've written like 800 articles? Like my name is all over Google. Somebody actually created a Wikipedia account. It's pretty accurate. Clearly, I exist. I'm here, right? Then the following year, when I was 18, my history teacher, Mr. Farrell, showed us this documentary on Harvey Milk. I didn't know who he was. It's called The Life and Times of Harvey Milk. And at the end of that film, Harvey Milk says, if a bullet should enter my brain, let that bullet destroy every closet door. And I was sitting in the back of the class, and I'm like, I can't be in the closet about two things at once. So I had to get out of one of them. So I raised my hand and told the whole class, I'm gay. And then I ran out of the class. And then it was brunch, and then my girlfriend found out during break that this had happened. But I was out. I was out of one closet. But it took me 12 years till I was 30 to come out of this immigration closet, right? And a turning point for me was actually when I was 29 years old and I had the opportunity to profile Mark Zuckerberg for The New Yorker, which was for me like a dream assignment. This was before that movie was supposed to come out, The Social Network. So I landed the exclusive, and you know, Mark is really not that guy. He's not that guy in the movie. He's a pretty social guy. So at one point while I was interviewing him, he actually turned the table on me and he was like, hey, Jose, where are you from? Which is like such a fundamentally simple question, right? But I just looked at him, I did my eyebrow thing, and I just like, I didn't know what to say. Because where I'm from is lying about a big part of who I am, right? While working as a journalist whose job it is to tell you the truth. Where I'm from is working and hiding and living very comfortably, while a lot of these young undocumented people called dreamers were risking their lives while I was making a living and hiding from the government. Where I'm from is I've been here since I was 12. I haven't seen my mother for 20 years, and I can't even face her. That's where I'm from. So after writing that Mark Zuckerberg profile, 6 months later, after telling people like Simon Rosenberg, hey, Simon, I'm about to do this, I come out for the second time, and I'm totally done coming out. Like, no more coming out. And my goal in coming out was to detail in a 4,000-word essay what people like me have to do just to survive here. And to tell people that we're not just mowing your lawns and babysitting your kids, that some of us are actually going to college, that some of us actually want to be one of you, right? That many of us seek and aspire for an American citizenship that most people take for granted. So against advice of like 28 lawyers, I wrote this essay, right? And then I waited. I knew people read it because it was like the most read article on Google for 2 weeks. But then I'm surprised that no one contacted me. Like no one from the government said, what's up? So then after this, I called the editor of Time magazine about 8 months later and I said, hey, Rick, I want to write a cover story about why I haven't gotten deported. So then I actually called Immigration and Customs Enforcement, used to be called INS. And I'm like, hey, I haven't heard from you, what's up? Are you gonna deport me, why and why not? And what was interesting was this woman who was like kind of shocked on the phone, she was like, off the record, what are you doing? And I said, what are you doing? And she said, we can't comment. I'm like, I'm on deadline for time, I need a comment. No comment. And you know, I actually think, you know, I grew up, this is where I'm from. 101, 280, this is where I'm from. I actually think that's like a metaphor for what the general American public thinks. No comment. You all know we're here. You know we're driving alongside you. We go to the same church, we go to the same school, we go to the same grocery store. So what do you want to do with us? We can't all just mow your lawns and babysit your kids. Or is that what you want us to do? And then I decided in this entire 3 years to film. I've been kind of chronicling this. Originally, I was going to do a film on like waiting for Superman meets the Dream Act. That was my original conception. I called Davis Guggenheim. I'm like, I'm going to do this. And then the film, as any documentary filmmaker will tell you, the film kind of took on a different direction when I decided to go to a place where I couldn't go, which is the Philippines. So I sent the film crew to film my mom. Because, I can't leave. So if I leave, they won't allow me back. There's no guarantee. And she can't come here because she's been denied a tourist visa twice, and she's on a 14, 16-year waiting list. So actually, here's a trailer for the documentary that CNN is going to air this summer, and that's going to be in theaters starting in May.
Jose Antonio Vargas of the Washington Post.
Jose Antonio Vargas is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist.
I lived the American dream, building a successful career as a journalist. But I was living a lie. I'm gonna tell you something that I haven't told a lot of people. I'm actually an undocumented immigrant. Immigration is stories, so here's my story. My grandparents legally immigrated from the Philippines in the mid-1980s. My grandfather decided that he was gonna get his grandson to come to America. One morning, my suitcase was packed. I was 12. It's been 18 years since I've seen my mother. So I'm launching a whole campaign about what it means to be an American and the fact that I am an American. There are 11 million undocumented people in this country. In 2010, undocumented people paid $11.2 billion in state and local taxes.
My name is Erika Andriola. I'm from Colombia.
From Nigeria.
From Brazil.
I'm an undocumented immigrant from Germany.
We mow your lawn. We work at your houses. Maybe we're your doctors. Maybe we're nurses. We're not who you think we are.
People who have come here illegally should not be citizens of the United States.
So what happens in Iowa if you discover as a cop that somebody's an undocumented person?
I'm looking for freedom, looking for freedom.
A major blow for immigration reform. Today, the Senate voted against the DREAM Act.
I'm a conservative and I'm a hardcore Republican, but I don't agree with them on this.
You're an illegal alien.
No, I'm an undocumented immigrant.
No, you're an illegal.
Wait, no, actually, this
I think I've broken a law just having you in my studio.
Who is really the Americans? I would say people who came here to do good for this country.
We dream of a path to citizenship. We dream of contributing to the country we call our home. I have this fantasy that I get a green card and I fly, and that my mother would be there waiting for me.
I'm looking for freedom.
So it'll be in theaters. There are postcards outside for information on the film. And I have to be honest with you, I spent 10 years of my career writing about other people, right? As a journalist, I'm not supposed to be the story. I'm supposed to tell you the story. So this has been incredibly uncomfortable to be on this other side and all of a sudden give you my mom. I didn't want to do that. I wasn't even ready to see that, and then here I am putting her in a film, right? But if there's anything I've learned in my travel in the past 2.5 years, is we have to make this personal. We have to make it about what happened to the Italians and the Irish and the Eastern European Jews. We have to make it about America and not about the Latinos in the border, about the Asian people or the people of color who are changing this country, right? It's about what this country is about, right? And the politics of this issue is so broken that we need to transcend the politics and use and change culture. The saddest thing for me as I've traveled around the country is how many people literally use the words illegal and Mexican interchangeably. A travesty of monstrous proportions. And this civil rights movement is happening right under our noses, right? And for the most part, we think of it as a brown Latino issue. And we are not going to get anywhere until we raise the level of consciousness of black people and white people in this country. So that's part of our goal, right? And I have to tell you, I have a few more minutes left. When they asked me to speak at this event, the WorldAffairs conference, last week I was in Wilmington, North Carolina. I did an event. It was really interesting, actually, because we had a pretty good turnout. Like 1,000 people showed up. We showed parts of the clip for the film. And then about a third of the crowd was African American. And after the event, this young woman, African American young woman, came up to me and said, you know, like, I love that you're fighting about, you know, to be an American, but why can't you be a global citizen? Then I turned to her and I said, like, oh, I would love to be a global citizen. I mean, I'm already a global citizen in the world under Google, Facebook, and Twitter. They don't need a passport for me to join, right? But before I can be a global citizen, can you give me a green card first? Can we be recognized as citizens of this country first? So I'm gonna fly out here to go to LA. And so people don't know and don't understand that to be undocumented is to obsess over documents and to not have documents. So after I came out, they revoked my driver's license. So my only piece of ID is this Filipino passport that the Philippine embassy issued. And there's no visa on this passport. It's just my face and my ID. So I'm gonna show it to the TSA woman, you know, when I fly today. If she flips it around and she sees that there's no visa, they can actually apprehend me, supposedly, theoretically, right? But that doesn't happen because I look like this. What's interesting is I've heard horror stories from people who use a Mexican, you know, passport who do get apprehended or who get stopped, right? And here's the thing. As far as I'm concerned, I am an American. I'm just kind of waiting for my country to recognize it. And we really need your help. It's wonderful to talk about world politics and global citizenry and to care about, you know, what's happening in globalization and the impact of imperialism and globalization. But what is happening right in our own backyards? And what is your role? Your silence is no longer acceptable. And we really need your help. So thank you for having me here this afternoon, and I look forward to the questions.
Awesome.
Well done.
Thanks.
Jose, that was terrific. Thank you very much. We're going to have some brief remarks here and just have a little conversation here. And Tara Magner, let's start with you.
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Tara Magner, and I'm a program officer with the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. But today I am here speaking with my own views and not representing the views of the foundation. And I also have to say I'm one of the many lawyers who, upon reading your first article, was panicked for you. Because what Jose's presentation illustrates is that for so many people who are in the United States and have been for a very long time, there is no path they can walk down to obtain legal status. There are very limited exceptions for this, but for most of the 11 to 12 million undocumented, there's simply no way under current law to obtain lawful status and walk down a path toward a green card and eventual citizenship. And I think that is a profound misunderstanding among the most of the American public. So I was going to give a few opening comments on the cost of inaction on immigration reform. For a long time in Washington, people thought we would take up immigration reform about once every 10 years, 1986, 1996, 2006. But in 2006, Congress failed to enact a law. The following year, they tried and failed again. And now we're 7 years later, right back in that situation, where we have one chamber of Congress has acted and the other has not. But the status quo and this inaction is not serving anyone's interests at this time. People in immigrant communities are suffering the effects of aggressive enforcement of the immigration laws, and many families live in fear that a loved one could be apprehended and deported at any time. The undocumented immigrants themselves feel that most intensely because they don't know on any given day driving to work, driving to school, going grocery shopping, checking in for an airline flight, whether they might be apprehended and deported, oftentimes leaving US citizen children behind. The people who are opposed to immigration reform are also grossly unsatisfied because they believe that the Obama administration, just like the Bush administration before it, is not doing enough to enforce the laws. And in particular, under the Obama administration, the new trend is to cry foul over an imperial presidency, that this president is picking and choosing which laws to enforce and which ones not to enforce. In the lawful side of the immigration debate, we have long family waits, family green card waits for people like Jose's family. An immediate family member from the Philippines can wait 20 years for a green card to join their family in the United States. And so that creates family separation as well. Meanwhile, the business community is frustrated because business owners at every level of the skill and wage economy are having trouble finding the workers they need. So an employer that hires highly skilled or highly educated workers complains that they cannot obtain enough employment-based green card holders, and the students that have been educated in the United States often run out of time on a student visa and have to go home or risk becoming undocumented. In the lower wage areas, employers also complain that they cannot find US citizens or lawfully present immigrants to do dangerous and difficult jobs, and so they're forced to hire undocumented immigrants. And in the overall economy, we're not taking advantage of the fact that immigrants who are present would like to be working, consuming, buying homes, buying cars, starting businesses, being entrepreneurs. And so the economic growth of the United States is harmed by that lack of reform as well. Meanwhile, jumping back to enforcement, we're now spending, in the three parts of Homeland Security that focus on immigration enforcement, we spend more in those three agencies than all of the federal criminal law enforcement agencies combined. So we spend more on an annual basis than the combined budgets of the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Secret Service, the US Marshals, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So I frankly find it astonishing, after working for many, many years on immigration reform issues, that Congress has not come to its senses and found a way to solve this problem. But I don't think you can work in immigration unless you're an eternal optimist, so I remain optimistic. I don't know if we'll get there this year, but I do think that Congress is lurching toward trying again, and I think Simon may focus on that some more in his comments. Thank you very much.
Great. Simon Rosenberg, would you like to focus on that in your comments?
So first of all,
you don't have a choice now.
I just want to thank Jose, my dear friend, and we've known each other a long time. I've never seen you do your thing.
Do my thing.
And wasn't it great? Right? I mean, he's really amazing. And I'm so proud of him. I think I was the third person you came out to in this crazy, and I told him he was crazy, right, when he told me he was going to do it. But it's great to be here. I want to make two quick comments because I think we want to engage all of you, and Tara did a phenomenal job at doing an overview of the costs. And so just two quick things. First of all, about the demographic changes that Jose alluded to and how we're changing, right? You know, for most of American history, our country had the racial composition of the U.S. was essentially an overwhelmingly white majority and an underwhelmingly and powerless black minority. I mean, there were a few Asians and Native Americans in there too, right? But in essence, the overall nature of who we were was this very powerful majority and a very powerless minority. And then in the 1960s, that really began to change, right? We know the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act really put America on a different racial trajectory that allowed things like Barack Obama to come along, right? But we also, the Immigration Act of 1965, changed the immigration targets in the United States away from white Europeans towards Asians and Latin Americans. I mean, this was a purposeful decision, in part because Europe wasn't generating the kind of immigrants that we had historically gotten from Europe. That, you know, my parents came from Ireland, my grandparents came from Ireland, Germany, Latvia, and Ukraine, right? And those kind of folks just weren't coming anymore. And so those two things together, the civil rights movement and also the Immigration Act of 1965, will go back, and when you think back in recent American history, were these dramatic events, right? Because it set the country off on a very different racial trajectory than we've been on throughout all of our history. And we all know that race has been a complicated and difficult subject for the US back to the founding of the country, with 3/5 of a person being enshrined in the early documents of our founding, right? That we know today that the country is on a, and you know this all in California better than anybody else, right? But as a country, we'll be a majority-minority country by 2040 or so. The estimates are that this year will be the year that school-age children will be majority non-white, that the crossing point for kids is this calendar year of 2014. And that this kind of change, this level of change that we're seeing, and is something that would be hard for any civil society to manage. I mean, it's rapid, it's huge, it's very different from what had come before. And I think, on balance, and we can talk about this, we're actually managing it pretty well compared to what you've seen happen in countries like France and other places. There are pieces of this, though, that we got to fix and we got to get about dealing with. But I think, first of all, we can't underestimate how hard this is for some Americans who literally feel like this isn't the America I grew up in. What happened to that America that I grew up in? Well, it's no longer there. We're entering a different period in our history, one that's unlike any other period in American history. And I think the opportunity we have is to make race not something that's exploitive and pernicious, but something that we can that's about celebrating our differences. What a great opportunity. Second quick point is on what happens now. Look, I've been working for 9 years, since 2005, when McCain and Kennedy introduced the grandfather of the bills that were still, essentially they created to show you how innocent that period was, right? John McCain was getting ready to run for president, and he did an immigration bill with Ted Kennedy, right? And because at that point, this issue had not become toxic and polarized, and there had actually been a long history of bipartisan cooperation on this issue. How innocent that seems now compared to where we are today. But that bill, which is essentially still the construct that we're operating under, we show that Democrats and Republicans can come together in the Senate and pass a really important and meaningful bill that would grow the economy and update our immigration system and allow folks like Jose to be part of the American fabric. And we know there's been enormous resistance in the House. I do think, though, that I think there's a real chance that we can get this done still this year. John Boehner is sending all sorts of signals that he wants to get it done. He's trying to drag his conference along with him. And I think that if the public stays engaged, if Barack Obama feels that the wind is at his back, and that we could actually get a meaningful immigration bill passed the House. There isn't actually, we can get into this if we want in the Q&A, my own belief is there's not a vast difference any longer between what the House Republicans want and what the Senate passed. It's much more about politics than it is about policy. This isn't like the enormous policy differences that existed on healthcare, where there were legitimate and serious policy debates going on. The Republicans don't really, in the House, don't have an alternative to the Senate bill that they're cohering around. When you look at their principles, even though I could quibble with pieces of it, the principles they just put out, the principles themselves are a cousin of what's in the Senate bill. And so you could see, in a more reasonable age, people coming together, cutting a deal, and getting this done. And so I remain optimistic, and I think a lot will depend on whether those forces inside the Republican Party, the business groups, the agricultural groups, high-tech organizations, evangelical organizations that are mobilizing at very high rates, right? The Catholic Church. I've never been in rooms with so many Catholic priests as I have been on this immigration issue. If they continue the pressure, and if they mean it, then I think we've still got a chance to get it done. And we'll all be celebrating Jose's green card with him not too far in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Great, Simon. Thank you very much. So we will engage in a discussion here. I should point out, you're not actually boring me. It is the NCAA tournament this week, but I'm actually just taking notes on my phone. That said, I'm also going to be stealing great question ideas as you send these up here. So let me get to some of these. And as you mentioned as your disclaimer, I don't speak for Mayor Mike Bloomberg The really dumb questions are mine. You probably would like to take credit for my smart ones, but that's probably something that's stole from you guys. But when we talk about economic costs, because that is something that I focus on in my work, what would the economic? Let's play out the fantasy. Maybe it's not the Tea Party fantasy. Maybe it is. Let's play out the fantasy. If we deported 11 million undocumented people in this country, what would the economic impact be?
I think you'd immediately see a significant shutdown in the agricultural industry, and looking at the states that have passed state legislation that has curtailed the ways in which people have hired immigrants, which is to say that many agricultural growers hire undocumented immigrants to work, but many of those undocumented immigrants are presenting false papers. So there's a little bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge going on there. But in the states that have passed very draconian immigration laws, many immigrants have left. And Georgia farmers and farmers across the South have talked about not being able to find workers to pick the food and the food rotting on the vine. So in certain industries, I think that you would see, if not collapse, a wholesale slowdown. Other industries like meatpacking, construction, retail, it's not just house cleaners and strawberry pickers, it is people across the spectrum. So you would see a significant labor shortage in several industries. You also have many people in those populations who are now paying federal taxes and payroll taxes. About 50% of undocumented immigrants pay payroll taxes in every paycheck. And the Social Security Administration receives about $1 billion a year from that fund. So those are just a couple practical examples. But I think you also lose the entrepreneurial spirit, the small business creation. 40% of small businesses started in California over the last several years were started by immigrants.
Yeah, Jose, we talked on the phone last week and talking specifically about the issue of taxes and the amount of taxes paid and the.
That's part of the to me, the two biggest misperceptions that people have is that there is no line, right? People will yell at me, "Get in the line." I'm like, sure, where's the line? Is it on the corner of 4th and Mission? Because if it's there, I'll see you later. I'll get in line. There's no line, sir. Then the second thing is, why don't you pay taxes? So actually, when I travel, I usually carry my H&R Block tax forms with me, and also the stubs from the Social Security Administration.
You really show people how much journalists make?
Well, I mean, I was actually fortunate. I was making a pretty good living. But what shocked people is when you show them, what's interesting about this is like we pay into the system, right? Like for example, I've been working since I was 18, so I've been paying to Social Security since I was 18. Now that I'm out as undocumented, I actually can't collect anything from that. So that's really interesting. I mean, I should be a Republican. I've paid so much taxes. But people just don't know that. I was going to say, so in the trailer, we said that $11.2 billion paid in 2010. In the state of California, where about 10% of the workforce is undocumented, it's $177 million in state income taxes, $736 million in property taxes, which mean we actually, own property.
Own America?
No, in California. This is just in California in 2010. America, right. And $1.8 billion in sales tax. Because when you and I go to Starbucks together, we pay the exact same sales tax. So again, people just don't know this stuff in general. And this has been, as I said to you on the phone, really a large failure of the media. And the fact that this is an issue that they put in this box and in this corner, and also a failure of the lack of diversity in the media. I remember being a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, the first minority-majority region in the country, and there were 2 people of color in the entire staff of reporters, right? So one last thing. This is really important people understand this. So there's 11 million of us. There are 17 million households in America that are called mixed status households. So I'm Filipino, so we're like the Italians of Asia. We have huge families, right? So out of 25 of my closest relatives in the Bay Area, I'm the only one of 25 who's undocumented. So all of the rest are tax-paying American citizens who, when you call me illegal, and when you talk about this issue, you're talking about like me. You're talking about like their grandson and their nephew and their cousin, right? People don't understand that this issue is completely integrated in American life. It's not in some corner or some border somewhere. People don't know that.
Simon, when you, as discussions happen in the halls of Congress or whatever, and I realize you both can answer this to some degree, how weird does the conversation get? I mean, are there, or let me rephrase it. How wide are the parameters in what's possible being discussed? Is there a discussion, as I put, let's kick them all out? Do legislators really say, is there someone out there who's really thinking and saying that? Is there someone conversely saying, why do we have borders?
So, in 2000,
I'm talking about people in Congress.
So in 2005, a few months after McCain and Kennedy introduced their Senate legislation, the House Republicans passed a bill to deport all 11 million people, not self-deport, but actual deport. It was one of the most shameful, in my mind, pieces of legislation passed by our Congress in the modern era of American politics. And it also provided for the funds to make sure the deportation happened, right? That's what, for those of you who remember back to when the Latino community sort of rose up in the spring of 2006, they were rising up against that bill. It wasn't a pro-immigration movement. It was the idea that there had been a bill in Congress that was calling for their deportation and felonization, which meant that they could never return back into the country, even if they had legal children. They could never come back into the U.S. ever again. So it was extreme. So where the Republicans moved in 2012 is that Mitt Romney was just for self-deportation and attrition, so there was a significant shift away.
You think?
Well, that was a little bit of a joke. And the Republicans are struggling, I think, with moving beyond that position. I mean, I would say that if for most Republicans in Congress, their solution is, there's only two solutions in the undocumented, right? They stay or they go. That's it. I mean, there isn't a third way on this one, right?
Well, the third way is what we have now, which is a non-answer, which is...
Well, but if you're posing a solution, right?
Right.
So the Republicans, one of the reasons they haven't come to the table is that I think most Republicans want them to leave. And that was the position of the Republican Party in 2012 as a national political party. And it was the policy of their candidate. But I think there's a political recognition that that's just bad politics and isn't the right thing for the country. And so they've moved a long way. I mean, I would argue that the House Republicans have come very, very far, which is why I'm still optimistic. But this week, for example, there was a debate in Congress about getting rid of DACA and getting making the dream eligible kids now eligible for deportation again. So we're still wrestling with this. On the other side, there is nobody arguing for open borders. And I think that even Democrats have come to accept that the enforcement regime that's in place is a necessary, even those who are skeptical of the efficacy of it, recognize it's a political necessity in order to build support with the Republicans in order to try to get this other piece of this business done that we want.
Tara, do you recognize a big shift as well in Congress over what period of time?
I do, and I think in some ways you have a slightly similar conversation going on within each party, insofar as on the Republican side, there seems to be a debate over whether and when to agree to have a legalization program of some sort, and then how onerous or generous should that be? Should there be any path to a green card? Should there be any path to eventual citizenship? And what is that? What is the price of that? Is it a massively expanded border security, which is already, the number of Border Patrol has already doubled since Homeland Security Department was created in 2003. The Senate bill would have doubled it again. The Senate bill's border price tag is $46 billion. So I think that the discussion within the Republican Party is centering around, can we get to legalization? Should we go beyond? And what will we extract in exchange for that? And I think in that view, for the good of the country, for national security, and to ensure that we don't have a situation 10 years later where we have another new population of undocumented immigrants. I think on the Democratic side, it's a conversation about whether to accept legalization without a path to permanency, or to hold out for the path to permanency, which I think is a very hard conversation in that sector, because there are people who are experiencing deportations in their communities and their families every day who are saying, enough. We'll take legalization if it ends this for our communities. And others are saying, no, we can't accept that, we need to hold out for the path to permanency because we want to be members of this society, we want to be citizens of America. So I think in some ways you have the same debate, but coming from very different perspectives.
When we cover this for Bloomberg West, it's almost always a discussion of H-1B visas and getting high-tech workers. This notion that we're going to bring in the next founder of a WhatsApp or some $11 billion revenue moment, revenue to the guys who own WhatsApp, not revenue for WhatsApp, because it's Silicon Valley. Why would you have money, or God forbid, profits? But I wonder about the notion, Jose, let me ask you about sort of segmenting parts of this that could get done where there's broader support, like high-tech workers.
So as you probably know, Mark Zuckerberg has started a group called Forward.us, right? Which is advocating for immigration reform. And I remember when he said that he was going to do this, we had a conversation, and one of my first questions was, this cannot be only about H-1B visas. Because if it is, I'll be the very first person in line raising my hand saying, you can't do that.
Well, it very clearly isn't. I mean, he's very
exactly.
focused. So why?
Because I think it's important. Now look, of course we need more engineers in this country. Of course I want, especially because, you talk to any CEO or any engineering company and startup here in the Valley, right? They talk about the shortage. And this is the fact that we're not creating, unfortunately, enough, STEM students, right? Graduating and actually can do this job. So we need people to do it. I get that. Of course, the DREAM Act is the lowest hanging fruit that we can't even pass. Mm-hmm. But I think it's one of those things where I get ever since I was, since I moved here since I was 12, and I grew up in the Proposition 187 era that permanently politically changed the state of California. I mean, you would think that Romney and Jan Brewer were watching what happened with Pete Wilson in the 1990s, but clearly no one was paying attention. This issue has to be solved in a comprehensive way, right? It has to be about the whole thing. It can't just be about now. I remember last year.
Why not help one problem get done? Like get the things done that can get done.
I am all for doing a piecemeal. Let's take care of this. Let's take care of that, knowing that we'll take care of the whole thing altogether at some point. But at least, and Simon, because he's in these conversations more than I am. My worry here is that, for example, Paul Ryan or Boehner would say, okay, we'll do the DREAM Act and then let's wait 4 years to take care of the other ones. Well, who do you think are the parents of these dreamers? I remember being in North Carolina. I was so surprised by this. I was in a rural town in North Carolina, surrounded in a coffee shop of about 20 first-generation Americans, who some people call anchor babies, 20 first-generation North Carolinians whose parents are all undocumented. And then they told me that it was their first time to register and vote. And guess who they voted for? People don't know that, right? So that's just the kind of, I think, thinking about this in a really comprehensive way and thinking about how do we actually solve this in a way that deals with it once and for all. I just don't know. I mean, thankfully, Simon's optimistic and Tara's optimistic, and I am a little optimistic, but knowing the level of, I am a reporter at heart, so that's why I went around traveling like a crazy person. I always had anticipated that there was a huge gap between the perception and the reality. I would not have anticipated that it was oceanic, right? And it is an ocean. And this is why we need kind of the media to help us do this, right? We need culture to change so that we're not talking about this border. What is the border conversation really about? Never mind that 1 million of the 11 million people came from Asia. I came here on a plane. So I don't know what border you're talking about, right? So it's tough. I feel like we're totally not on the same page, and our politicians are reacting on what's out there that is in many ways misperceptions.
We forward. It's funny you say forward.us because when I say it on TV, I say forward.us.
Oh, because I told Mark, hey, dude, this is about us, all of us.
Here. But I think when we did this, they did a hackathon.
Yeah.
Of undocumented hackers, and they were going to spend, I think, a 48-hour period to come up with something.
Yeah.
Just something, create something on this issue. And I love the story, I love the thing, but I was just telling my directors, my producers, like, just show the video. Just run the video, the shots from that room showing that it's not Cesar Chavez, right? It's something else, and just to kind of without saying it, just show it different. Which is, I don't know that it does anything, but that was kind of the goal, to just show it different. So that's one of the things I enjoy about your message. And I'm going to try to not read directly, because a lot of these, I'm trying to merge these together, a melting pot, if you will. But I will read one without using this one of the words, and see if you can guess which one. It's effed up that you haven't seen your mother in 20 years. Stay strong. That's awesome. Here's a great one, though. Why has the Obama administration, put this to you, why has the Obama administration deported more people than any other?
Thank you for that
Great question.
This is very topical to what's happening in Washington this week. Part of the argument we've been making is that all that money we've invested in enforcement has really paid off. Crime on the U.S., despite very difficult politics, despite the fact that the cartel violence in Mexico is very real and something that we can't ignore, crime on the U.S. side of the border, because of this investment, has plummeted. The two safest large cities in America today, based on violent crime statistics, are El Paso and San Diego, the two largest cities on the border. Right? Second is net migration of undocumented immigrants coming across the border has gone from 10 years ago, about 700,000 a year, and it's 0 today. Meanwhile, trade with Mexico has doubled in the last 5 years, and Mexico now is our second largest export market in the world. There's over $1 billion of trade daily with Mexico. Mexico buys twice as much in the United States as China does, right? And is now arguably the single most important economic relationship we have with any country in the world. On the deportations, which was part of the strategy that Obama inherited from the previous administration, they've dramatically changed the nature of who's being deported. And in 2013, based on new data that came out from ICE just a few weeks ago, 364,000 people were deported. 2/3 of those, were people who had just crossed the border, were apprehended illegally crossing the border. And 1/3 were in the interior of the U.S. Undocumented immigrants in California and so on. 100,000 of those were convicted criminals. And if you exempt one other little section, only 10,000 people of the 365,000 people who were deported last year were law-abiding undocumented immigrants. That number in 2009 was about 150,000. So the Obama administration has radically changed the way the deportation strategy is being implemented, putting much greater emphasis on border crossers and criminals. And he deserves much more credit, frankly, than many are giving him for having taken a very difficult situation and made it far better than it used to be. For those who are worried, if you're a law-abiding undocumented immigrant, right, Jose Vargas, right, only 10,000 Jose Vargases got deported. That's too many last year, right, too many. But it's a sea change from what was happening when Obama became president. And so I think the way, if you want the deportations to stop, there's only one way for it to stop, which is for us to pass immigration reform. It's going to be impossible for the President of the United States to unilaterally stop deporting people who are either violent criminals or border crossers who've been captured. And I think this is going to be a very vital part of the debate going forward.
Tara, the possibilities out there that we could have a Republican Senate after this year's election. Yep. The immigration issue certainly hurt Romney. All the exit polls that looked at that found that. But nonetheless, that possibility is out there. Would it be easier to pass immigration reform if we had Republican House and Republican Senate?
It's a good question. I think that the content of the bills would be different. It's likely that a legalization program without a clear path to permanency might be what emerges. Now, that could emerge through compromise anyway, but I think that is more likely to be the product if one party controls both houses. I think, though, in the long run, And one of the reasons I remain optimistic is that we have seen slow but steady change of mind, maybe hearts and minds, in the Republican Party. And after the 2006 bill passed the Senate and was not taken up by the House, all of the members of the Republican Party at the national level and in positions of national authority who were advocating for immigration reform stepped out or did not seek re-election or what have you. So Ken Mehlman, Karl Rove, Mel Martinez, and others were no longer vocal on the national stage or sitting members of Congress or directing policy from the White House. And there was sort of a long walk through the desert where those actors were doing their best to educate their party to what they thought was the long game. And I think until the 2012 election, when over 70% of Latino voters and over 70% of Asian voters voted for one party and not the other, those lessons started to sink in. And so I think that if the Republican Party controlled both chambers of Congress, those lessons would still have to be taken into account. But I think how it played out in bill language is a little hard to predict right now.
I mean, you say that, but there's a big schism right in the middle of the Republican Party about establishment versus non-establishment still, maybe even more aggressive now.
Well, and I find it interesting that the top four members of the leadership of the House Republicans are all in favor of addressing this issue head on. Yeah. John Boehner, Eric Cantor, Paul Ryan, and Representative MacArthur from California are all game to do this. And the real challenge they have is finding compromise within their ranks.
Of the, Jose, let me put this to you, of the major provisions in that are discussed, what if you had to pick two that you really need to see that are just deal breakers, what would they be? Necessary, absolutely necessary above all else.
Two. Well, I mean, I've talked about the border stuff. I just feel like we're not on the same page in terms of what the facts even are, right, on that. So it's really hard to agree on higher enforcement when you're like, wait a second, people, like, what is really the issue here, right? And for me, like, what I've learned, I spent a week at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa doing lectures. It was really interesting. And I learned, like, using the word racist is like, it just stops everything. So I've really learned to like not use that word and like really hear. I feel like the greatest gift that journalism ever gave me is like empathy. To kind of try to understand why people come from where they're coming from, right? There's that. But to me, the biggest question really is this idea of citizenship versus legalization. I mean, that's why we called our campaign Define American. We didn't call it Define Immigrant, right? And this whole idea that, haven't we done this before? Haven't we done like 3/5 in the Constitution? Like, haven't we done sub-citizenship before? Don't we know how this story ends? Haven't you seen Lincoln? Like, right? So I just don't. It's really tough because like I've had some conversations with some Republican members of like, okay, we'll get on legalization, but that's as far as we can go. And then I think my job is, look, I never want to call myself a victim, but my life is subjected to the ignorance and the indifference, many of whom are the politicians who are making these decisions, right? I'm in no position to tell you, all I can say is, really, is this what America is about? Is this what we did when the Irish came here and there were newspaper ads that said no Irish need apply, right? Like, is this what we did? And what's the difference? Is it because I just feel like we're not asking the harder questions? And I don't know, like, would I take legalization? The question I get asked a lot is, would I take legalization without citizenship? And then I usually turn it around and I say, would you? So why don't you want to make me become a citizen? Am I a threat to you? Are we threatening? Or is it really about you?
Well, I was going to save this question for last, but I won't because I can't wait. But you threw out the word racist and said you wouldn't use it, which is a great journalistic trick. But I'm
not a journalist anymore, apparently, Corey. I'm like something else. I don't know what it is, but it's something else.
But I wonder, and I'd like to ask each of you briefly, why do you think people are opposed to this? And I don't know, but and maybe it could be any number of things. What do you think?
I think that there is a fundamental discomfort that people experience when they see their community change around them in ways that they don't quite understand, right? And we see this with the refugee resettlement population, people that our government has extended a welcoming hand to from overseas, brought here and brought into our communities, and the receiving communities suddenly find 25 new languages, perhaps mental health issues because people have suffered persecution, et cetera. And the receiving community can be a good, open-hearted community and yet still wonder, how will this affect the schools? How will this affect healthcare in my community? So I think that there are ways that people process these issues that are not necessarily overtly racist, but sort of rooted in discomfort or concern for their own children, their own family. And then, of course, there are much more negative and in fact, in cases, some racist attitudes as well. But I think the best of us can have those moments where that discomfort puts us in a different frame of mind. I think also for many people, I've heard people in the camp of opponents of immigration reform or opponents of additional immigration, period, including lawful immigration. There's a sense of a violation of American sovereignty, a sense that when people have crossed the border, they have trampled upon our flag, and that they must make some sort of amends to us, to American citizens, to solve this problem. And that's why you see things like in the 2006 immigration bill, one of the proposals was for people to go from undocumented to lawful status, they would have to leave the country, you know,
10 years,
it was never quite clear whether they just had to go to Tijuana or they had to go all the way to whatever the country of origin was, but touch home base and then come back in lawful status. And it almost
like the
had
picture bulked, exactly. You got to go back.
It had the quality of a sort of religious cleansing of that undocumented status. And I think that what I want to say though is for the people who feel this, I think they feel it very deeply.
Yes.
And I think your point about empathy is exactly right. You're not going to change their minds unless you can appreciate that they actually do feel that way in a very honest way for them.
Jose?
No, Simon, go first.
Simon, go first. No, I agree.
Simon, you go first, sir.
So, first of all, in almost every poll taken since 2005 on this issue, 55% or more support immigration reform. So this is not a divisive issue this is not there's a clear majority that wants this to happen. There's a clear, very vocal minority that doesn't. Remember, we elected an African-American president twice with over 50% of the vote in the United States. A majority of the country is reconciling itself to the enormity of the racial transformation that's happening in the country, which is one of the reasons I remain very optimistic about this. However, as I said earlier, and I just want to agree with what Tara said, is that, for a lot of people, as I said earlier, is that, this is a very rapid change. I mean, John Edwards, if you remember, in 2008, talked about that his hometown where his father was a worker and how people went to work every day. That hometown in rural North Carolina is over 50% Latino now, right? Yep. And the best food in that town isn't, fried chicken, right? It's tacos and burritos and other things. And so you can understand why, given the rapidity and the volume of change that we're going through, that people would be like, WTF, right? I mean, what happened here? Mm-hmm. And how did we get here so quickly? The second point is that I think this issue of sovereignty, I think, is really important. And I think it's the key to unlocking some of the Republican opposition, which is a lot of the Republican feeling in the House is this notion that it shouldn't be up to individual people to come into the United States. The United States must have some mechanism for deciding who comes in and who doesn't, right? That's a reasonable thing. And that's not crazy, right? Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't view this idea of the rule of law and this argument Republicans make oftentimes of, we need to have a functioning legal immigration system. The United States must make the decision. It can't be that 700,000 people walking across the border is something that's common and routine in any kind of, we have to be able to make decisions as a sovereign nation who gets in and who doesn't, right? And so I think that the empathy that Jose was talking about is really important because many of the positions that Republicans hold on this and many of their reservations are not unreasonable and are not racist. I mean, It's about velocity of change. It's about the way their communities are changing, about, hey, we shouldn't have allowed all these folks to come in. There are bad actors in this debate. There's no question about that. But I think for a lot of older Americans, boomers and folks, they just want more comfort that everything's going to be okay. And we've got to do a better job, I think, in making that case that this transition that we're talking about is going to be okay and make us stronger and better than worse and different.
Note to self, that's the first time I've ever heard boomers described as older Americans, but the numbers are...
They are, baby.
I'll take your word for it.
Walk around this city, you know that.
Jose? Why?
So there's actually a scene in the film in Birmingham, and when I'm interviewing this restaurant manager, and this belligerent drunken dude just jumps into the conversation. And it was like, hey, you got your papers? He was asking me if I have my papers. If not, get out of here. And so I engage him, and we talk, and we capture this on film. And then all of a sudden he changes when, again, I say, oh, I've been paying taxes. I was like, oh, okay. But what about those people who are, knee deep in their apartments, right? And then he brought up the really, really interesting point, which I'm so glad, thankfully, the audio worked, because when you're a film, audio is really important. Think of the audio work in which he says, I'm a contractor. I'm a blue-collar guy. I want to charge, $30, an hour for this job, and if these illegals come in and they want to charge less, that's a really fair point, right? So then I turned to him. I didn't get his name because it was like, well, wait up a second. So why are you blaming them when you really have to blame the employers? Like, we're a country addicted to cheap labor. That's been the history of who built the South? Like, that's been the history of this country since its inception, right? Like, we put up a sign outside the US-Mexico border that says, like, keep out. And then 10 yards in, we say, ooh, help wanted, right? So we have to have a really honest conversation about who we're blaming here. And so blame is important. Because I feel like I have to tell you, I was so spoiled growing up in this area, right? That the level of disorientation that people feel having their communities literally changed overnight, right? Latinos and Asians in the South and in the Midwest. People feel like their country got taken away from them, and this Barack Obama and Michelle and JC and Beyonce and Jeremy Lin and Jennifer Lopez and me all took it from them, right? And so to be able to say to them, look, like, we like your apple pie. Can you have some lumpia too? It's Filipino egg rolls. Like, to just have that conversation is so important. And we're not having that kind of a conversation. People want someone to blame. It used to be blacks, and it still is to some extent. It used to be the gays, and now people understand the culture had shifted. And now, generally, it's the illegals, because they want someone to blame. And this is where I think, this is why for us at Define American, I go to Ohio next week for a couple of days, really going to places, right? And really try to open up a space where we can have a more honest conversation about the issue. And not about politics. I am not privileged enough to be a Republican or a Democrat. All I know is my life gets played political football with, right? So, yeah.
Well, and I think that's a very important point that we haven't talked about much, but there is a reason that in the very strong economy from 2000 to 2007, 500,000 or more immigrants came to the country each year in undocumented status. They came because there were jobs.
Yes.
And as long as that job magnet was so strong, people would come, and leaving behind communities where they couldn't put food on the table often for their family. So that's a fairly logical choice for someone to make. But I think that part of the reason undocumented immigration dropped off after 2008 was the economy was in bad shape, the housing market collapsed, and those jobs didn't exist.
I mean, some of the impetus behind comprehensive immigration reform itself changed. I wonder to your notion, and there's a couple questions about this in here, that it's been sort of an every 10-year issue. Even if this gets through this year or next, are we looking at 2024? Get ready.
Well, I think one of the reasons...
Just when you thought you were safe.
Well, one of the reasons we have these debates about whether it should be comprehensive or piecemeal is that some of these issues, some of the pieces have been tied together for logical reasons, and some of them have been tied together for symbolic reasons. But oftentimes, legalization of the undocumented, with or without a path to permanency, is tied to ramped up mandatory electronic verification of status. Because the argument is, if you're going to legalize the undocumented population, you have to then ensure that there isn't a new flow that comes in, right? And so if no undocumented person can get a job because there's mandatory electronic verification, then those two things have worked together to solve part of the problem. But then you have to add the family visa backlogs, because if an immediate relative is waiting 20 years for a green card, they might come on a tourist visa and stay. Yeah. Right? So suddenly you've got the family visa backlogs in, and then all of then the dreamers get folded in, and the agriculture job reform. And so all of a sudden you go from piecemeal to comprehensive. And so I think part of the challenge here is to satisfy sort of get all of these pieces in the puzzle aligned, just so that people have confidence that by passing a law now, enacting a law now, you won't have another several million undocumented immigrants a few years down the road.
Can I just add one quick thing? So the other thing that's changed is Mexico has changed dramatically, right? I mean, Mexico is, the economy is modernizing and growing. The family size in Mexico has plummeted. It's almost now at developed nation status. We're going to be at about 2.1. The replacement rate in any society is 2.1 kids per family. Mexico is now almost there, down from 6, 7 kids per family 50 years ago. They're not going to be producing the same number of rural, uneducated workers that can be easily exported into the United States. And also, Mexico is taking much greater responsibility for stopping the flow. This is a sea change that the current president is initiating, where there's now, for the first time in U.S.-Mexico history, joint northern border patrols, where there will be Mexican law enforcement patrolling the northern border of Mexico to prevent Mexicans from coming in. Because Mexico is starting to get to the point where they realize that the brain drain is hurting them. They don't want folks to leave, right? They want them to stay and build lives and build the economy of Mexico. The second thing that's happening is that you've had a huge, increasing percentage of those captured at the border are not Mexican. It's now a majority, right? Yeah. Salvadorans, Nicaraguans, and others. And so Mexico, for those of you who know Mexican history, right, they don't really have a southern border. It's open. I mean, you can sort of walk across. It's kind of amazing to think, given what we have. So Peña Nieto has announced there's going to be a southern border. They're going to erect a border, and they're going to make sure that they have the ability, because the human rights violations, I mean, some of those worst stories of the 70 bodies buried in the desert and the headless bodies were migrants who were coming from other countries crossing through Mexico, right? And so they realize this is a tragedy that they have to do a better job stopping. And so Mexico itself is really, in a way, the transformation of Mexico is going to be a major piece of this. And let's be clear, it's not only Mexicans, right? This is, as Jose said, but the recent migration has been largely Mexican, right? So this really matters, and I think that you just won't see those same circumstances that will produce the kind of Mexican diaspora that we've seen. Remember, 10% of everybody living in the United States today is of Mexican descent. 20% of all the Mexicans alive, people of Mexican descent in the world, live in the United States. We are now, as much as we grew up in the United States, thinking of us as sort of a little bit west of Europe, we're also north of Latin America and east of Asia now, in a way that we never were before, because of who, Tom Friedman's going to talk about globalization today. Our economy globalized over the last 20 years, but so did our people. And that's something that we're really going to have to, deal with as we go forward.
Last question.
I'm so glad you brought that up. So I got invited to do something with the UN, and 232 million migrants around the world who live in countries from which they are not born. I did an event in Arkansas, and this man, when I was saying that there was 4 million Filipinos in America, he said, "Why are there so many of you here?" And he said this kind of in an angry way. And so I had to come up with something really quick, and I'm like, okay, we're here because you were there. That's why we're here, right? What McKinley did, the Spanish-American War, the Philippines as the first Vietnam, the first Iraq, what Mark Twain wrote about, remember that? Like, what we don't even talk about when it comes to this issue is, what does U.S. foreign policy and trade agreements have to do with migration patterns? Why are people here? People don't get sent here because they enjoy crossing the border. My mom, she didn't send me here because she didn't want to see me for the next 20 years of her life. She said that a better life was available here. Well, why not the Philippines? Well, then who impacted the economy of the Philippines? Who used to own the Philippines? We're not even getting to that conversation because we're so busy talking about the illegal border stuff. That's the real Tom Friedman questions, right? And I hope you guys asked him that tonight. Unfortunately, I can't be here. But, you know, like, that's really important.
I want to get to one last question here. I'll modify only slightly. When you get documentation, what's the first thing you're going to do?
I'm going to go see my mom. And then I'm going to go, oh, thanks. And then I learned English by watching movies from the Mountain View Public Library, and Anne of Green Gables was a big part of why I talk English the way that I do. So Prince Edward Island, Canada is going to be the second place where I will go.
Enjoy the mussels.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Sure.
Thank you.